Hey guys, Naz here. So I've had a lot of requests for this tutorial. It's how to make a sitting quadruped. So that could be a cat or a dog. You could even modify this into a dragon. You just need to be a bit more creative with the details that you put onto the character, like spikes or tails, things like that. You might want to make them have fiercer claws. What I'm doing here is I'm just doing a little sketch, and that's just going to give me an outline for what I want this pattern to sort of turn out like. If you already have an image of your character sitting from the side, that's probably what you should work off of, but I'm just making up an imaginary sort of puppy pattern in this scenario. But you can see that I've drawn the body, I've drawn the hip, I've drawn the feet, and I've made sure that the feet are pretty much on the same plane, so I've drawn a little horizontal line just to make sure that, you know, one foot's not massively taller than the other one. That'd be a bit strange, so I try and keep all my feet and all the paws at the same height. Whenever I'm making any sort of quadruped pattern, I almost always work from the side view. You do need to have a front reference if you're going to be making the pattern really perfect to your character, but actually drawing the pattern is going to be based off the side. So I finished my sketch here in Photoshop. You could just do this on a piece of paper and then draw on top of it with another piece of paper, but I just like to draw my patterns digitally. So now I'm just tracing things out. I'm tracing the torso along the back, and I'm tracing this little hip section. So this little hip section is going to sort of stick out a little bit on our sitting pattern. I'm going to be patterning the front legs now, so just drawing my paws in there. You can see I've drawn my straight line to make sure that the paws on the front and the back are starting at the same place. I'm going to copy the paw from the front and take it over to the back just to make sure that they're the same height. And you're really just going to be drawing out kind of like a sausage shape with the bottom cut off for the back leg, back foot. I'm going to be making this separate. I just find it a lot easier than incorporating it into a sitting pattern, but you can change that if you would like. Now I'm just drawing the direction that I want the nap to go, so I just want it to go down on this piece, marking the front and the back of the pattern and adding some little reference key marks that we're going to be using for patterning later. They'll also make it easier for us to sew the pattern together, so having those registration points there. So now I'm going to be patterning the inner parts of each of our legs, so the inner front leg and the inner back leg. I'm going to be doing a bit of an elbow on this puppy, so it's going to have a bit of sort of width sticking out at the back of its leg rather than just having a stump coming out of the bottom of the pattern. I'm also going to be drawing sort of like a half moon shape for the inner part of the back leg. If you've seen my previous tutorial on patterning thighs, where I showed that on a pony pattern, that will explain that in much more detail, but this little piece is going to be what pops our back sort of thigh outwards on our sitting pattern. So for both these pieces, we're just copying the outline of the existing pattern that we've drawn earlier, so the outer body piece, and we're just drawing those inner parts, so they're going to match up perfectly to our outer pattern. Here I'm just working out where the belly is going to intersect with this inner half moon shape, so you can see that I've just pivoted that line starting at the top of the hip across to work out where exactly that middle belly section is going to hit. I'm also going in and I'm just drawing some reference key marks on these pieces, and they will help us align our gusset and make our gusset in the first place and sew all our legs together. So the half moon shape that goes on the inside of our thigh, that's going to start at the top of sort of the inner thigh and is going to go around to the rump. You can have it come up higher up the rump, but I prefer to make it a little bit lower. The higher you bring it, you start to get sort of like bottom cheeks sort of thing. So if you're just making like an innocent little puppy, you probably don't want it to have little bottom cheeks, I don't know, but I prefer to just end it sort of halfway up the rump. That usually works. So now I'm going and I'm patterning the paws or the bottom of our feet. So this is going to be the bottom of our back leg and paw. So I'm just shaping it. I usually just shape it how I would like the bottom of the paw to look. And here I'm just going along and I'm making sure that it matches up with the length on the bottom of our side back foot pieces, and just drawing in where it's going to line up with those key points. You might need to make it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter so that the length match both the outside of your bottom paw piece and the bottom of your back foot piece. So here I'm just drawing the front paw, just drawing what I think the paw will look like, going along and making sure again that half of the perimeter of this paw piece is going to match the length of the bottom of our paw on our main pattern. And I'm just doing a couple of little reference marks there. I'm just extending the back of the foot just to be a little bit of a cheat so that it matches the length of the paw, of that half paw perimeter, so that it's going to fit. So now I'm just adjusting the pattern slightly. When you're doing things like these front elbow sections, you don't want the back of it to come up too much. It's kind of the same principle as our half moon shape at the back here on our thigh, but you don't want it to come up too high, because otherwise your belly is going to have to wrap around that elbow and is going to become too thin. So as usual, when I'm patterning, I'm drawing out my key reference marks that I'm going to use to make my gusset, and I'm numbering them as well. So you've got the 0 starting point at the top of the neck, 1, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to draw a straight line and rotate that along the pattern, marking off the key points. You want to remember that these pieces are going to bend around the half moon shapes. It might be a bit complicated if you haven't seen me do that before, but take a look at my thigh patterning tutorial, that will really explain it. But you are going to be following along where this gusset is going to be meeting up with those inner leg pieces as well as the side pieces of this main pattern. So this gusset, just quickly, is going to start at the top of the front of the neck. It's going to go down the neck, under the belly, between the legs, and it's going to finish at the right side of that half moon shape that we've drawn earlier. So I've drawn all my reference marks. I'm going in and I'm just putting in all the numbers so that I have a rough idea of where each of them are, and I'm using that to work out how wide do I want half of this gusset to be. I don't want to be drawing the gusset both sides at the same time. I just want to draw half, flip it over, and then we have a perfectly symmetrical gusset. Just clean it up a little bit. You can also change the width of this slightly if you want it to be a little bit wider or a little bit skinnier. As long as you don't make that gusset too wildly wide, then thin, then wide, really crazy widths, your line should still match up with your points. So here I am tracing out the pattern on Minky. So I'm just, as normal, tracing everything out. You will need 2 of each piece, facing different ways, and then we're going to start sewing this all together. So when you're tracing out your pattern that has things like hips and elbows and things like that, just go ahead and start off by tracing the entire pattern's outline. Don't cut out any of those inner lines just yet. I'll show you how we're going to do that in a second. So we've traced out the rest of our pattern, not super exciting. Now we're going to get that side body piece, and we're going to cut out those lines of where the elbow and that front of the hip are going to be. And you're just going to place that back over your pattern, lift up the middle, and then you're just going to add those lines to the interior part of your pattern. So you can see here now it sort of matches the drawn image that we made in Photoshop. So it's easier just to do that separately, do the outline first, then make the cut, because it can make the pattern a little bit flimsy if you make the cut and then try to trace everything out in the first go. You can cut everything else out normally, but once you've cut out the outline of these side pieces that are going to have the hip and the elbow, you want to just get in with a really nice sharp pair of scissors, and you want to cut out those 2 lines that we added, because that's where our sort of little mini gussets are going to be poking between. So you're not going to be able to sew directly on that cut line, obviously, but we're going to be sewing as close to them as possible. So the first thing I'm going to sew is I'm going to sew our back legs together, and I'm just going to sew the upper portion. So we're going to leave the bottom straight lines. They're not going to be sewn yet, because that's what's going to be sewn to that bottom long paw piece that we patterned. The first thing I'm going to do on our side body pieces is I'm going to sew the front legs on. Now you're going to pretty much ignore the cut line that we've done. We're going to just match it up and act as if you're going to be sewing as close to that cut line as possible, obviously without sewing so close that you're going to pop your seam and have gaps. But here I am just pinning the sides of those back feet and we're going to be using those little reference lines that I told you to put in. You can put in as many or as little as you like. I like to put about 3 in on a piece like this. And that's just going to help you make sure that both your pieces are lined up perfectly. So I pin all of those little reference lines, then I usually pin between the pins that I've put in, then flip it over to the other side and pin between all of those pins on the other side. I probably pin pretty excessively compared to most people, but I prefer to do that extra pinning just to make sure that I don't have to unpick and sew multiple times, because that's a real pain. And especially when you're going to be sewing things here like the elbow and the hip, when we're going to be sewing right next to that cut line, you really want to make sure that your pinning is really thorough, because if you don't, you can really run the risk of the minky slipping and then you sew across somewhere you're not supposed to, and you might have holes, and just generally you're going to have to repeat sew it multiple times. When I first learned how to sew things like the hips, I definitely had to do it by hand. I usually hand stitched it, and eventually I moved on to being able to machine sew it. So don't feel bad if you want to hand sew it. It is a really tricky fiddly thing to sew with sort of this very minimal seam allowance here in the hip. So here I'm just repeating the process, pinning that front leg, that inner front leg section to the outer front leg section. And you can see that I've pinned the top and the bottom of the pattern. I've pinned all those points the reference points that I added, and then I've pinned the other side, and this just stops the minky from curling underneath itself and getting caught. But you can see here, now I'm going to add the half moon shape. You're going to start the inner part of the half moon at the top of the hip. You're going to pin the outer, like the last part of the half moon, on that little end of the rump section that we marked on our outer pattern, and then we're just going to pin all the way in between, and you can sort of see that I'm going to be sewing the outer sort of long curve of the half moon against that outer hip piece. And just repeating the process here. I didn't add as many reference points as I could have, but it's quite easy to sort of just fudge it and make sure that it's sort of matching up the outer half moon shape. So you can see that I'm pulling the rest of my pattern out of the way. You want to sew when you're sewing against these straight lines that have been cut. You want to have the side that has been cut facing upwards when you're sewing, so that you can see what you're doing and you can see that you're not going to be slipping off that edge there. So now for the tricky part, we're going to be sewing the hip. So I'm going to do this as slowly as possible. So this stretch here, this line here, this is going to be sewn to the inner part of our half moon. And I don't know if you remember earlier, I pivoted that inner part of the half moon to work out where it would match up with the bottom of that belly, of the back belly. That's the reference point that I'm going to be matching up the bottom of that belly piece to. So you're going to pivot it at the top of that hip, so pulling out your sort of little half moon piece so it's sitting up, and then you're going to pinch it together and you're going to line up the bottom of that belly piece with that little marking that we drew in initially, and then we're going to sew this together. So one more time in real time now, we're going to align this piece with the inner part of the half moon. So we flip it over at the top of the hip, we pinch that point, and we're going to line up that side of the belly with the inner part of the half moon. So we're going to pin, first we're going to pin at the top, and then we can pin at the bottom or vice versa, just to make sure that those lines are going to stay lined up with each other. And then you're just going to add an absolute ton of pins, the same process that I mentioned before. You really want to make sure that this is very well pinned, because you almost have no seam allowance. You're really sewing as close to that cut line as possible. You're obviously not sewing on the cut line, but you're going to be sewing 1 or 2 millimeters away, a very tiny amount away. So pin on one side thoroughly, pin on another side thoroughly, and you can either choose to hand stitch this, which is much easier and definitely recommended, but if you feel confident enough with your machine, you can go ahead and you can machine sew this. I personally sew over my glass head pins, but I wouldn't recommend it because there is always a danger to yourself and your machine, but that's what I do and what I've always done. I don't really find I have personally much problem with sewing over these very thin glass head pins. You don't want to pin both at the same time, but I'm just going to show you on the other piece. We're going to repeat the same process for the elbow here. So treat that inner part of the upper leg as that half moon, as that short side, or that shorter curve of the half moon. So you're pinching it at that intersection point, and the front of that belly section is going to run along part of that inner leg piece, and we're going to repeat the process. So it's pretty much exactly the same, just slightly different shapes, but that's going to be what is going to give you that little 3D sort of elbow shape at the back of your puppy or kitten's leg. And we're just going to do the same. We're going to pin it thoroughly, and you can either hand sew or machine sew this piece, but as I said before, don't try and pin, if you're going to be sewing this pattern, because it's so close together, don't pin that inner hip and the elbow piece at the same time. You're just going to have too many pins in an enclosed space, and it's going to make it difficult to sew the other. So either choose to sew your elbow first or choose to sew your hip first. Don't do both at the same time. So now we're just going to be sewing our paws on. Not very complicated. If you haven't sewn paws or hooves or things like that before, I have tutorials for all of those, but really you're just lining up the front mark on the front of your paw with the seam at the front of your side paw pieces, and lining the back mark at the very back of your paw with the seam at the back of your two paw pieces. And you can see that I've just pinned all the way around using those little reference marks that I told you to put in. That makes pinning these much easier, especially with paws can sort of be uneven shapes. It's not like a hoof where it's perfectly round. You sort of have your big paw, your paw bits at the front, and then it tapers off at the back. So it's not as simple as just eyeballing. I would really recommend putting those points in. And when you're going to be sewing things like paws or hooves, put an absolute ton of pins in so that there's no messing around and it's not going to slip. You can also hand sew those if you're starting out and you're not as confident with your machine. So we've put all our paws in, we've done all our inner leg pieces. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to be sewing along our back down to the base of that rump. So here I'm just double checking where that end of the rump is going to be. It's at the start of the back of the half moon shape, so I'm pinning both my sides together there, pinning them at the top of the back of the neck, and then pinning all those points that I told you to put in earlier. That's just going to make sure everything's lined up nicely. And we're just going to pin along that back and down that rump, and we're going to sew that together, and we're nearly done apart from our gusset. After you've sewn each of these seams, I would definitely recommend chopping off your excess seam allowance. I do this on all of my plushies. Just make sure to not take too much off that you're accidentally going to cut into your thread or make it too weak. I usually leave a couple of millimeters on the side. So now we're going to start pinning our gusset, and we're just doing one side at a time. We're starting the top of the gusset at the point 0. If you remember, we made the points so that they would be 0.1 on the gusset will be 0.1 on the side of the chest, and we're just going to line all of those up. You're going to have them go along the inner part of your inner legs, as you can see here. It's going to go along that belly section there, and then it's going to travel up the inner portion of our half moon to the end of our little rump, which is the intersection of the back of the half moons and the bottom of the rump on the side pieces there. So you're just going to pin all of your little key points that we put in, then put pins between those, flip it over, put pins between all the pins you've already put in, if that's as much as you want to do. If you can do more or less depending on what suits you. But you're just going to repeat this process for the other side once you've sewn along this line, and then we've pretty much sewn our little puppy all together and we have our sitting pattern. So now I'm just going to turn all the pieces inside out and we're going to start stuffing. And I'm just going to do a really quick and nasty job of stuffing here just because this guy is a little test. and just showing you guys roughly what the pattern looks like. You can put a bit more effort into stuffing if you would like. This pattern here isn't perfect, it's just a first try at making a sitting pattern. It usually takes me several goes to perfect a pattern if I want to make it look exactly like a certain character. So you may need to go in, you may need to make the rump high, you may need to make the legs longer, you may need to make the neck thinner or thicker, depending on the character that you're going for. So I've stuffed those little back leg pieces and pinned them on. You would go ahead and you can hand sew those on if you would like to finish up that pattern. Here I'm just going to really quickly show you guys me thread sculpting the paws. I'm again doing a quick and nasty job of hiding the knot in my thread, but you can use a matching colour or you can use something like black if you want them to really stand out and be cartoony, but I'm just going in here and doing some thread sculpting on the paws to make them look like paws, because at the moment they're just sort of these little sausage balloon shapes, and I wanted to show you guys what it can look like when they actually have little paws on them. You may notice with this pattern, because we put the elbow in and that's pushed our pattern out from the back, he's a bit pigeon-toed, so our little puppy has his paws facing inwards a little bit. I'm going to show you guys after this how to edit that so you don't have the elbow in and you won't get that pigeon-toed effect. Or you could edit this pattern to have the gusset between his legs, between the front of his legs. You could make that wider and that should help correct the pigeon toe a little bit, or you might like that because it's kind of like a cute little look, but that's just a part of pattern making, you know. If you're going to make your hips very wide, it's obviously going to push your feet out. You can see the back feet on him I pinned in line with the hips, and they're pushed outwards because we've added that half moon shape to sort of kick out and give width to those hips. So the same with our front paws, we've added some width to the back and that's pushed his toes inward. So that's just a little thing you can learn from making patterns like this. You don't want to add too big a half moon shape or too big elbow piece like I was showing you guys, because that's really going to massively kick out and distort your pattern. So start off with a smaller half moon piece, see how that looks. If you want it to be wider, then you can go wider, but try not to go too crazy to start with, because it can really throw your pattern out if you want to put in a massively kicked out hip. So if you want to learn how to do thread sculpted paws and parts on your plush, I think I have tutorials for that, but otherwise you can just search how to thread sculpt paws on a puppy plush and you will probably find something on YouTube or Google. But you can see here how the pattern turned out, pretty cute for a little pup. Here I'm just going to very quickly show you how to remove the elbow section and just have a standard generic front leg that's going to be very straight. So we're just going to re-overlay our inner front leg, and we're just going to make sure that the back of the front leg of the inner piece is going to line up with that 0.4 of the belly. So we're not going to have the pattern cutting into the side, we're just going to have it falling naturally along the belly here. So you guys are welcome to use this pattern for whatever you'd like, just don't sell the pattern itself. You're welcome to make commissions or sell plushies using this pattern as long as you credit me. So if you do use it, just pop a little credit in there somewhere, pattern by Nazi Goring, and you can maybe link to the tutorial or something like that. That would be super appreciated. If you do use the pattern and modify it, please still credit me. You don't have to credit me if you make your own pattern starting from scratch using the tutorial, but I would really appreciate any shout outs. It really helps me to get more people onto Patreon, and it helps motivate me to make more tutorials for you guys. But I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to send me a message. I'm online almost all the time and really happy to help you guys out. So I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!